Beth, welcome aboard to the show. So happy to have you here today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm honored.
So, would it be terribly insulting to call you a little bit of a dying breed as a journalist?
Yes.
Okay, tell us more about why the answer is yes. And are journalists a dying breed or aren't they?
Are they a dying breed?
And let me qualify this question and say an investigative journalist.
Yes. Yeah. I was definitely an investigative journalist. I would say journalism overall is not necessarily a dying breed, it's an evolving one. I think how journalism is perceived and carried out now is much differently than what it was, back in the day of the old legacy media. Because, podcasting, is streaming services. So, and the access to cell phones, and we can all go live on our cell phones from how many different platforms now, right? So, anyone almost with a cell phone can call themselves a journalist if they wanted, and it's kind of perceived that way. So I think it's just a perception how things have changed and evolved. And something good, I think, as a result of this evolution is things are much less rigid, and structured, and you get to have more conversations and do these interactive interviews without having to keep something like our stories on the news were always a minute 30. That's not a lot of time to pack a lot of information in, and, viewers would get upset at, "Why can't you tell us the whole story?" Well, because 'cause I've got a buck 30 to tell you? And so with friends, I used to say, "Hey, sit down and start to read something, and I'll set my stopwatch." And I'd stop them at 1 minute, 30 seconds, and they're like, "I'm only on paragraph 2." And I'm like, "Welcome to my world?" So I
So,
think it's just changed and evolved, and just about anybody can almost call themselves a journalist now because of cell phones.
but let me kind of zoom into my question, specifically investigative. So
Okay.
I'll get on my soapbox here for a second, and I'll say why I think investigative journalists are a dying breed. We used to have ads that were paid by newspapers were getting that money, and newspapers did investigative journalism. And then Craigslist came along, and then, that took a lot of that revenue away. Google came along, Yahoo came along, now AI is coming along. It really hurt the revenue of newspapers. And we're seeing today a lot less investigative journalism than we did in the past. My concern is that that's kind of one of an unofficial, let's say, arm of a democracy.
Mhm.
And it concerns me a little bit. So when I kind of gave that tongue in cheek question, I was fishing for your perspective.
Interesting you asked that. Last night at dinner, I had this very conversation with a group of friends because they were telling me they have a hard time watching the news now because they're like, it just seems like people take what someone else says at face value. And you can't. And I was certainly not known for that. I was probably a good cross of old school journalism and new school technology because,
Tell us
I
what
kind
that
of,
for our audience. Tell us what that means. Old school versus new school.
yeah. So old school, building context, building rapport, learning how to dig for information, because that's a skill into itself. Learning how to access the information gatekeepers of various agencies, whether it's the FBI or the IRS or your local school board. Learning how to find documents, where to go in the court systems. Every state has something different, or the federal system, obtaining documents, FOIAs, Freedom of Information Acts. So I kind of grew up in that environment of we, the reporter, ask hard questions. That's our job, is to hold people accountable, ask hard questions, truth to power, if you will. So I grew up in that environment. And then, as you get along in your career and you get 10 years under your belt or 20 years, and now we entered the age of the internet, in the early 2000s, and then online social media, that sort of thing. You have to learn how to navigate that technology, which is whipper fast. We went from having initially when I started in news, we had a couple of deadlines a day. Maybe you had the noon newscast, the 5, the 6, maybe the 10 p.m. Well, with the advent of the internet and social media, you have almost hourly deadlines. Or as soon as you're at a press conference, you got to start pumping that out on your phone and on social medias. And that takes away something I think is very valuable. News gathering takes a little bit of time, and if you want to vet the information and make sure it's accurate, And you have to in this day and age. You cannot take anything anyone says or prints or reports at face value. You have to vet it and dig through the facts and verify that these certain things are true or not true. And so that takes its own kind of time and technology as well. And since you asked investigative specifically, investigations by their very nature take time. Well, in the media, we don't always have a lot of time. It's feed the monster 24/7. Go, 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 go. So you move as fast as you can and you learn to become very efficient because of the new technology. But still, I had some of the old school in me of like, hold on, you know, I've been around the block. I know a thing or two. Wait a minute. I don't think that's entirely exactly true. And so to start digging down and verifying information or debunking information, that takes some time. And I think that's maybe one reason why investigative journalism is prevalent as it used to be, because it's extremely time consuming. And all media agencies, they've got to turn stuff fast, and we call it the content king. You got to keep that content coming. But to verify the content, that takes time. Some people have teams of researchers that can do it, but usually that's at the network level or extremely high. But you look at kind of our everyday average media or in your market, your cities, wherever you live, it's going to be up to the journalist to do all of that. And also digging for information and learning how to make the contacts, the appropriate contacts that can get you the accurate information. And there's a difference between being right and being accurate, right? And so if you want accurate information, that takes some time to go through the information gatekeepers to get that, amass it, put it together. And then some people are quite honestly afraid of investigative journalism. They don't want to be asked hard questions, so they'll duck and dodge a little bit. Where I came in, old school versus new school, I hear someone say, "No, I'm not going to answer that." And I'm like, You're an elected official. You are elected to answer this question, to represent the people, you're not going to get off that easy." And, and we can look at the climate right now with media. There's an air of intimidation. And some people will shy away of investigative reporting because of that. They don't want to deal with all that fallout, the intimidation, the threats, the lawsuits. People will sue over anything anymore, It almost becomes you're wrong until you prove yourself right in journalism. So, all of that can take a toll. Most of the stations I worked at still have investigative units, which I'm thrilled about because, never do I want someone to take a press release from some office and be like, "Hey, that's news." No, that's a start, but that is not news. It's up to you to go in there and find the news. And that takes also some experience and some strength, because you get pushback. People don't always want to answer questions about why they did this or spent that or, decide to, I'll throw out something, defund the police. I have a great example of that. Back in Minneapolis, right after George Floyd, and that happened on my watch. I was working that there was this big community meeting, probably tens of thousands of people at a park shortly after, where the big defund the police, movement came out of by the Minneapolis City Council members. And, they were standing up there, defund the police, defund the police, defund the police. Wherever you stand on that issue, up to you. But I'm like, as a journalist, okay, so you want to do that. How? Lay it out. You're a public official. It is your job to tell us how you're going to defund the police, right? Answer those questions. And I think that's where I was kind of a bridge between the two because I just,
This is you're presenting though an incredibly difficult challenge, right? Where, you had a minute 90 in the quote unquote old days. Nowadays it's sorry, minute 30. Did you say minute 90? Nowadays it's still 90 seconds, right? The shorts
yeah.
on Instagram, we're still in that paradigm. If anything, we're maybe worse off. I don't know, because how many channels did you add on the TV? Sure, men like to flicker between channels, but now it's everyone. It's all the time. Maybe you get, I don't know, 3 seconds before somebody will kind of swipe with their finger. And then on the other end, you're saying, well, you want to go deep and answer a question of, it's not just a slogan, defund the police or whatever the slogan is. It's about, let's think about how we would do this. What's the reason? What's the logic? What's the pros and cons? How do you do that in 90 seconds?
You become very efficient with your words when you're writing because you do just, and the time gets shorter a little bit, right? Because of attention spans, because if people don't hear what interests them pretty quickly, right? They swipe or delete or move on. And so you are very efficient with your words and how you write things, which is its own challenge as well as a journalist. Anyone who's ever sat down to do some writing, you realize it takes exponentially longer than you think it will to write a story, right? And so we have to be very efficient with our words. And there's a phrase I always keep in my head, and there's a poster on my wall: words matter. So you just get very efficient with your words. And I also think it's important then to tell the viewers or the listeners, okay, we can't get everything in. So you know what? I mean, this is where the websites, like a station website or newspaper website, you can tease to that, like, okay, here's what we can give you now in this report on TV to learn more. If you want to know more, if you have more questions, will you tag it to interviews on the wherever you're working, the media website. And so people can then sit down, watch something more in depth if they want to. And so we're able to give some headlines and a little bit of meat of the story, and then you give people another avenue to pursue more if they're interested in more.
There's a challenge that some people think it's new with this fake news concept, but there's no such thing as fake news. We just changed the name. It's propaganda, right? It's just a different name for the same thing. So we've had this forever. Everybody has an agenda. Everybody has a bias, and those biases come across. Now, my dad famously said, if you want to actually know what happened on the news, you need to watch 3 different channels, each one with a different bias, and then maybe you can piece it together from all 3. As 2 questions here. As a journalist, how do you kind of deal with the biases, your own and sometimes that are forced upon you by a certain channel or media outlet? And then how do you deal with the biases of your audience?
Boy, those are also great questions. I got to tell you, Ari, thank you for asking that, honestly, because that was something I kind of grappled with these last probably 5 or 10 years. Most importantly, the last 5 years, since the climate has changed everywhere, the biases. So I'll address that first, like from my standpoint. I think a couple of things for me anyway were a benefit for me in my career. I was born and grew up in LA, so I was in a very diverse environment. And nowhere special, nowhere ritzy, just normal neighborhood LA. My mom was a nurse, just normal America. And so that's kind of how I grew up. And then we moved to Oklahoma when I was in junior high. My dad got transferred. And that was a little bit of a culture shock and eye opening for me of like, okay, not everybody's been exposed and experienced all of this, right? And my friends and my neighbors are all different flavors and colors and shapes and sizes. So that's what I know. So I think that was one advantage for me kind of going in. Like, I just understand and I appreciate everything and cultures and life and whatever. And then, as I got into the business and got deeper into it, I'm like, okay, I've lived in Missouri, I've lived in all over Texas, Philadelphia, New York, all over Minnesota. And now I'm here in the desert Southwest. So people are different in different areas and they have different biases in different areas. When I moved from Philadelphia to Minnesota, and Minnesota is a wonderful place and, Fortune 500 companies, the people are smart. When I moved there in 2005, the crime was so minimal, and I come from Philly where there's 500 murders a year, and maybe in Minneapolis there were 25. But coming from Philadelphia, which is a very diverse city, and then you move to Minnesota and you're like, this is very not diverse. Okay. So you got to kind of, figure out how to operate in that terrain. I'm going to have to say, I don't think I have a lot of biases because I'm a pretty realistic person in just the nature of where I grew up. I've lived in a lot of cities and a lot of places where I was exposed to. So I think that's normal. Like just differences are normal. Diversity is normal. So I think that gave me a little bit of an advantage in that area. Now dealing with others' biases is another issue and a whole different, whole different terrain and experience and borderline explosive depending on the approach. There are certain communities that are very media averse. There are communities that hate the media. And then, some people think you have privilege and I always let people know I don't have a dog in your fight. I am here just to tell your story. Or guess what? You invited me to come tell your story, so let's go there. And people are entitled to their feelings and their opinions. When you're reporting a story and you're putting it together, though, I don't think bias has a place in its story, unless that is the story, whatever's going on. Unless that is the story, then you have to address that. I just don't think bias has a place in the story. Do people have agendas? You bet. And absolutely, whether I'll just use law enforcement as an example. Law enforcement, when they would reach out to the media or contact, would reach out to me with a story they wanted to get out there, maybe to teach somebody a lesson, right? They have their agenda. I have my agenda because I've got to get information. I've got to get a bunch of news and I got to do it quickly, very quickly. So it would be disingenuous to say no one has an agenda. Everybody does, because we all have to get some things done every day. But you manage that, you balance that with experience, you learn how to do it. Does heat come with it? Of course, I've been yelled at by the head of the NAACP and I've been yelled at by white nationalists. You will never make everyone happy all the time, but it is our job to walk that line as closely as you can of objectivity and not get involved, but report what you see, but also ask some hard questions. And usually the pushback comes when you ask questions that people don't want to answer.
When you ask those questions that people don't want to answer, to a certain degree, you're creating a reputation for yourself as somebody who asks hard questions. And if that reputation gets out, maybe people will be afraid to talk with you. How do you balance the kind of like, I need to be unbiased. I need to create a counterweight, so to speak, to the opinion that's being presented. I need to show the other side to give the balanced reporting.
Mhm.
But I also don't want to destroy relationships, so I can't do my job. That's a really tricky balanced line to kind of walk.
It is tricky. And I can't say I always did it perfectly. I didn't. I've made many a mistake in my career. Once you get a few kerfluffles under your belt, you start to learn, right? Like, okay, how are we going to but when you develop a reputation too for some credibility and trustworthy, and I'm a pretty straight shooter, and people get to know that very quickly with me. I also made it a point wherever I was living and working at the time to go sit down with the mayor, go sit down with, city council members. We'd go have coffee, meet with them. And I would tell them, I always, whenever I started at a station new, I'm like, give me a couple of weeks. Let me go make the rounds and meet everybody and the decision makers and the information keepers. And I would let them know I don't have an agenda. I am a reporter and I will do my job, just like you too will do your job. But I don't have an agenda. And, you know, we're going to we're going to interact and we're going to see each other. And sometimes they're going to be hard questions. And that's the price of you being in your position. And that's the price of me being in my position. That's the way it goes.
Open this to a broader spectrum just for a moment. Speaking truth, especially to power, can be dangerous. Now, this is not for you, it might be asking a politician a hard question, but for every single person in our audience, if they've ever had a boss, which I think is probably 90 something percent, you see things that are wrong and you're, am I going to put myself in danger because I reported this or because I said, well, that we should fix that? That can get you in trouble, right? People don't always appreciate truth. Is
No.
there any advice that you could give, not only as a journalist, but just to any human being listening to you? Is there a good way to do this, or is turning your head the other way sometimes the right thing to do?
I'm not a fan of turning my head the other way. And I understand that maybe some people don't want to take the heat or frankly don't want to be bothered, because you kind of know, I've sat in many a editorial meeting where other journalists are like passing on stories. And if I think there is legitimate news in it, I will pursue it. If I don't think there's legitimate news in it, then I won't. And I understand that what some people think is very important to them may not be important to the broader whole. And sometimes in news, I understand people get frustrated with news gathering because, you're covering a wide spectrum of a population. So there's only so much you can cover every single day. Um, you know, you get more experience and better at what you're doing. I think I have pretty good news judgment and people get their news judgment with more experience. But number one, you have to be straight up with people. Like, at one time I was this contractor taking tens of millions of dollars from everyday homeowners like you and I. And finally the homeowners couldn't get any help from legal avenues. And so they reached out to the media. And, I reached out to this contractor that was defrauding everyone. And I said, here's the deal. We're going to talk. I want to talk with you. I want to give you. So I met with this contractor face to face, Ari, and asked him the hard questions, but I was straight up. I'm like, I'm not going to go easy on you or anybody else because people, you've been taking money. I think if you're just very straight up and honest with people, and if they don't want to meet with you or share information with you, that also is their prerogative. But then no, okay, I gave you a chance to have your say. You don't get to condemn and criticize afterwards if you turn down the opportunity to explain your case. You can privately if you want, but that's why we will reach out to everyone. Let's hear from you and approach it from I'm a straight shooter. There's no dog in this fight. You maybe this new report is out that someone doesn't agree with. Okay, why don't you agree with it? I think if you're straight up, not that it isn't tricky, it's tricky. And, many doors have been slammed in my face and phones slammed down. And, my emails deleted by people because do some not want to speak with the media? You bet. Not everybody loves the media. But then also if you reach out to the media because you want something covered, well, you know, then you got to step up.
I appreciate that. It's a tricky job you have, and there's a lot
Yes.
of complexity to it that I think not everybody appreciates. I want to take you kind of back in time. You mentioned that you were born and grew up in LA, but your first job as a journalist, and I want to take you to tell me the story of the first day, the first maybe hour of how you were feeling, what happened, what brought you to Joplin, Missouri,
Yeah.
and just make us feel like we're right there with you.
Okay. That's a great question too, because that's kind of how I start the book. Like you're right there with me. So Joplin, Missouri, I was so stoked. My very first job, it's a little bitty market as far as TV news is concerned, but I was so stoked. And I think it was 22, 23. And my stepdad and I went to go find an apartment together. And kind of a funny story. We lived in Oklahoma City at the time and I just graduated college. So we're driving to Missouri about 4 hours away and we pulled into town. I was hoping to get into town by 10 o'clock news so I could watch the news because I was just such a news junkie and eager. And so we found this hotel and I remember my dad and I were checking in and the hotel clerk was like, do you want this room for an hour or you want it for the night? And we were like, well,
That's my dad, dude.
that's my dad, right? And my poor sweet little father, 5'4", you know, uh, yeah, horrified. Let me just say that. We were both horrified. And my dad was like, "Do you wanna work here?" And I'm like, "Gotta start somewhere, let's do it." And, so the next day then, I did go into the TV station for the first time, and when you drive to the TV station, it's in the middle of a farm field between, Missouri and Kansas, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and so you are in a farm field. So that was, eye-opening. It wasn't the swanky TV station people might envision. And the first day on the job, my news director, and she was like, okay, let's get you acquainted, fill out the paperwork, right? You're kind of walking around, meeting all the who are going to be your coworkers. And she's like, and then here's your locker with all of your equipment. And I'm like, equipment? And she says, yes, the camera. And it was back in the day when there was a camera and a huge recording deck and those big ass tripods. And all of them combined way more than I did. And she's like, "So this is your equipment. You're gonna go out, you'll shoot your own stories, and you will edit your own stories. You'll produce your own newscast. You'll write all your own stuff, da, da, da." And I'm like, "Wow." And all of that for I think my first year, I made 14,500. And I was like, "Well, I didn't know I was gonna be a one-man band, but, all right, this is my lot in life. Here we go." And so, when you first start to pitch stories and you're going back in the day of newspapers and making some phone calls, I'm new to town. And once you set up the interviews and you're going to go shoot videos, so you head out the door in a vehicle by yourself to places you've never been to before on your own with equipment you've never worked with before. You get a quick training as everything in news is trial by fire usually. And then you start to learn how to shoot appropriate interviews or when we would have to shoot stand-ups or even our own live shots. We did all of that by ourselves. So we'd use a light stand or what we would now use as a cell phone tripod, but use a light stand to set up where you were going to stand, zoom in, focus, pull out. You go run in front of that then and do your live shot because there's no crew when you're in these markets. You're doing it on your own. And, you're logging all your own video. You are writing your own stories. You're editing that. And everybody edits now on their phones. But back in the day when we were editing on the machines, that was videotape. People remember videotape.
Let's talk about this for a second because with AI, editing is just it's a whole new world today. What
Yes.
did editing feel like back in the day?
Oh my God, I felt like a dinosaur because you had big editing machines and you had tape. So you put, tape in one machine, a tape in another machine, and you're toggling and setting your in and out points of your video. And it's so time consuming. Even now, editing is time consuming with the advent of technology. So take the technology out of it. It's really more, doing something by hand and piecing it together and in video, there are frames of video, 30 seconds or 30 frames of video every second. So you got to toggle up with little pointer, but it was tricky. Editing was tricky. And what's great about those jobs too is so you're your own assignment editor, your own researcher, your own photographer, your own editor. You produce your own pieces in your own newscast if you're anchoring, and you're your own editor. And you always have someone else reading your script, usually the bosses, because of course the second set of eyes always makes the story better. So you're doing all of that, which gives me great appreciation for each individual role now. I mean, I totally get why editors have full-time jobs. Do you know how much time that takes? And photographers, yeah, you understand and really learn to appreciate everybody's job around you. The people in the control room, the directors, the producers, you really learn an appreciation for all those jobs because you do them all. And then as you start to climb through the markets, some of those responsibilities get delegated out so that we, the reporter, can better focus on actually gathering the news information to put that story together. Yeah, it was an adventure. It was the hardest I've ever worked in my life. And you make your best friends and you also become very adept at what you're doing quickly because you have to.
I'm hearing from you though that you have a deep appreciation for that phase because it kind of allowed you to understand and appreciate everybody else's job and kind of have that good connection with them. I
Yes,
want to
absolutely. Because being in a newsroom is like playing on a sports team. Nobody gets to the, goal line on their own. In news, you do not get your stuff on TV by yourself. It literally takes a village or a team, and so I have massive appreciation for every role in the news gathering process.
we are going to fast forward a little bit now.
Okay.
You just got the phone call that you have been nominated for an Emmy. What does that feel
Mhm.
like?
The first Emmy, it's like,
Absolutely.
you know that feeling when you fall in love for the first time? That's what it feels like. Because 'cause you're just this little cub reporter kind of starting out, working your way up to the top, and this is one of those hallmark moments that you always wanna get better and be the best that you can be. And the beautiful thing also about TV news is, you know, you can watch CNN or Fox News or whatever. You can watch other journalists that you respect and learn from them as well. That's a beautiful thing about news is you can watch others to become better. And you get that call of, "Hey, first you're nominated for an Emmy," and you're like, "I am?" Like, "Oh, this is good. Okay, I'm on the right track. Maybe I am doing what I'm supposed to be doing in life." And then you find out you win an Emmy, and this is important, from peers in the industry.
Yeah.
So your colleagues are looking at you going, "Hey, this girl knows a thing or two. What a great report." And that's a good badge of honor, you know? And it motivates you, or it did me, to wanna become better. I want to win more of those Emmys. I wanna win more awards. And it wasn't
And
just
you
about the
and you
award,
did.
and I did, thank goodness, hallelujah. Yes, but it's a good motivator, it's somebody throwing you a bone and you're like, "Well, that bone tasted good. Let's get some more of that."
So this is an incredibly hard question. Some people hate answering it, but we'll give it a try anyway. If you're looking back over a long, successful career, what's your favorite story? What's the one that stayed with you. And sometimes they're sad, sometimes they're happy. No judgment.
Okay. No, fair. I am thrilled to answer this question. The one that has stayed with me the most, there are two, but I'm gonna just keep it to one. So, Jamie Kloss, it was 2019, Barron County, Wisconsin. I was working for KSTP Television, the ABC affiliate in Minneapolis. Her parents, in the middle of the night, a stranger burst his way into their home in this little rural county, 2,000 people, literally everybody knows everybody. Stranger burst into the house, shot and killed her father at point blank range. Jamie's mother had grabbed her, and Jamie was a teenager, 13, 14 years old, grabbed her and was bear hugging her to try and protect her from this random shooter. Well, the random shooter shoots and kills the mother. So she falls to the ground. Of course, Jamie's, horrified and scared. And then the shooter grabs her, duct tapes her hands and her legs together, pulls her through the house, through her mother's blood, through her father's blood, then shoves her in his trunk and takes off, and she's went missing for 88 days. And when this happened, it was right around, I believe it was October-ish, November-ish of 2019. Barron County is 2 hours from Minneapolis, which is where I was based and lived. And so all the media is from the Twin Cities, because that's part of our coverage area, was going to Barron County. And, at first we're like, kind of what's the story here? Like, who would want to break into the home? What's the dynamic with the family? Da da da. And you dig into all that. And I think we were all just really blown away of how all American this family was. They really liked each other. They liked sports. They hung out together all the time. They went to church. Like, nobody had a drug or alcohol addiction or owed money to anybody that we could find. And Jamie was just a teenager. And what I'm so proud of about that is, so I kind of made a choice with my bosses too. I'm like, I'd like to stay, and it's hard to go back and forth 2 hours every day because you lose 4 hours of your day. So I'm like, set me up in a hotel, let me get to know this family, because if Jamie comes out of this alive, we're going to want to talk to the family and hear that survivor story. And so the family and I became fairly close, right or wrong. But I was in their business every day. And the sheriff at the time, he's so, so good. Sheriff Chris Fitzgerald, he would hold media press conferences, every day or every couple of days, keep us in the loop. So I'm living at this hotel, and we're trying to investigate who would have, come and just randomly kidnap this teenager and murder her parents. So fast forward to January 10th of 2020, escaped from her kidnapper, and I broke that story. I stayed there. I developed contacts. I spread a wide net, and day in and day out, I let people in that community know I was there, and I was there to try and help find her and uncover the truth of what all this was. And I got a tip that Jamie, here's the tip: Jamie has been found. That was the only tip I got, and I'm not gonna explain how it came and all of that. I protect my contacts and sources. But, okay, think about that phrase, "She's been found." Is she alive? Here's the hard question: Is she in pieces? Does her family know? What do you mean she's been found? So we didn't know how injured or if she was alive, what that meant. And so I'm racing up to where I know she was found and to break that story. What happened was Jamie did escape her kidnapper, and she was up in the being held at a cabin far northern Wisconsin along Lake Superior. And she ran out of the house in her kidnapper's clothes because she didn't have any clothes of her own because he didn't give her any. So, it's in the winter. You're going to freeze to death if you step outside at all. It's -20 all the time. And she ran into a woman who happened to be out walking her dog, who happened to be a trauma social worker of all things, you know, and she said to her, can you help me? This man kidnapped me and he murdered my parents. So the woman knew right then she was Jamie Kloss because there was a nationwide Amber Alert going on. And so the woman grabbed Jamie, took her to another neighbor's house that she knew had guns in the house in case the kidnapper tried to come back. And they called deputies, and then it started this whole cascade effect of deputies, taking Jamie to the hospital, getting her checked out, da da da. And a phrase I like to say is, Jamie saved herself. And that sticking in there, staying with that story, living out of a hotel for 4 months, and being able to break that story. And what was so special about it was when I learned that Jamie had been found, I made some phone calls to the sheriff. He didn't know at the time. I could tell. I knew his tone of voice. I'd interviewed him 100 times. So I knew Jamie had been found, but he didn't know. I checked with him. I checked with some other people. I checked with Jamie's family when I got the tip, and they were like, no, because earlier in the day there was a false report that Jamie had been found. And in southern Wisconsin, turns out to be completely false report. So all the family, everybody is like, no, that's a false report, false report. And I'm like, no, I know where I got my information. This is not a false report. And it also was incumbent on my station owners and managers. I had to tell them, trust me. You know me, I've worked for you for almost 10 years now. Trust me. This one is not a false report. Let's go with it. Let's get all of our resources up north. And I called Jamie's family after a number of false reports. And imagine her family get false report, reporters calling you constantly after this. And I'd called Jamie's family, and the family, and we got along very well, but they were pretty taxed out with the media that day. And I said, listen, Jamie has been found. Jamie is alive. You are going to get a phone call that she's being taken to this hospital. And I said, what I ask of you, though, is please don't make any phone calls as soon as we hang up, because I didn't want anyone to be able to track their phones. And frankly, I wanted to break the story, but I didn't want to break the story on TV. And that's how Jamie's family found out. That'd be horrendous. That's not even humane. So I said, I'm calling you because I know she's been found and I'm about to rush to the TV station. I'm going to get on the air. I'm going to break this. But she's been found, and congratulations. She's, physically um, in one piece. And her aunts were just like, are you sure? And I said, I'm absolutely sure. I'm going to hang up the phone now. I said, I would expect in the next 10 or 15 minutes, you're going to hear from the sheriff. And she's like, how do you know this before the sheriff? And I said, I'm not going to answer that. But I've been around long enough. I know what I'm doing. And while I was still on the phone with her, I heard her doorbell ring. And I said, there you go. There's the sheriff. I'm going to get off the phone. I got to run to the TV station now and get on TV. But I did not want them to find out like that. I wanted them to find out from me personally. Then the sheriff showed up, backed it up. And so I'm very proud of that, because I was able to give that family what they wanted, which was Jamie back. And then the sheriff can take care of the rest from there.
Wow. I mean, I have goosebumps. That is, it's just an incredible story. You get faced with the worst of humanity more often than most of us. What does this,
Yes.
what does this do to you?
Well, there are a couple of other things that during the George Floyd riots, I was shot in the hip. Um, and I got Lyme disease on the job, being bitten by a tick, going through some searches. And then I was also, my life was threatened, a gun pointed at my head by a protester during another demonstration. At some point, you do start to absorb the trauma that you see and that you cover. And that's kind of why I stepped away from news a few years ago, because after doing all of this for 30 years, and the last few experiences I had was being shot in the hip, having a gun pointed at my head because I was the media. He said, "You're media, you're next." And I'm like, "Oh, wait. I didn't work this hard, this long, and build my career to not be able to enjoy some sort of retirement at some point." So you do absorb the trauma that you see and you cover, and that you yourself experience. I've had chemicals thrown on me when I knock on someone's door. I've had people intentionally try to hit us with their vehicles or trip us up with equipment. So you do absorb that. For me, there was a period that drinking was a way that I, dealt with it to kind of numb myself. And fortunately, I got into recovery and a treatment program. But it became a point too that you have to realize it was the light switch for me. I would try to compartmentalize, and at the end of the day, flip that switch so I wouldn't take it home to my family or friends and make them endure and see what I did. But I chose that profession, and I love to tell the survivor stories. And yeah,
The young woman standing in that news station in Missouri, would you caution her in any way?
yes. And I would caution her in this respect: just be aware that the career that you're going into now, it has changed. There used to be a day, back in when I worked in Philadelphia, the media was the celebrity. and that was even when Allen Iverson was playing for the Sixers, and everybody was like, "Oh, what a great sports town," all that. And it was a great sports town and they were stars. But it was interesting because the media personalities were the stars, which was interesting. Those days are over. And so I would caution the young me of, this isn't really celebrity anymore. The job that you do comes with some hazards and be aware of that. Know that going in, and be aware of your safety, if you can, if you have a photographer crew. And once you get in larger markets, you do, you know, move with your crew. You go as a group. So I would and then just be aware that everybody has an agenda and what somebody says does not make it the truth. It's your job to vet that and get to the bottom of the facts and know that people will try to use you and manipulate you. Be aware of that. It comes with the terrain, not just journalism, it comes with almost anything anymore.
Yeah. Beth, what an absolute pleasure. Believe it or not, our time is up. We're actually over. This has been so
Well,
much
I'm
fun.
sorry.
No, it's always my fault, and it's only always because we're having so much fun. There's only one scripted question on this show, but it's a difficult one.
All right,
If
hit me.
you had to go back to the hardest point in your life, whether it was 6 months ago, 3 minutes ago, or 20 years ago, what would you advise yourself?
I would advise myself to give myself. I think everybody does the best that they can, whether you're a journalist or a doctor or a teacher or a podcaster or a nurse. I think everybody does the best they can, and sometimes they do what they can in life. Because we none of us know what the other person's going through that day or having a bad day. And we all have bad days, and sometimes we're off our game. Sometimes we aren't our best selves, and we make mistakes. That's human. Humans make mistakes. So I would tell myself to forgive myself for the things that I could have done better and to learn from the mistakes. The mistakes are not a character fault. Learn from those mistakes, forgive myself, and wake up the next day just knowing, okay, if I didn't do the previous day as good as I thought I could, or I could do it better, learn from that.
Beth, one last question. Tell us the name of your book and where we can find it.
Thank you. So you might be able to see, the poster behind me. It's called Stand By, which we know is a TV term for we all have earpieces in our ear and kind of that moment when you're in limbo of the control room of producer telling you, stand by, get ready for whatever's next. Because you don't know what's going to happen next. So that's the title of the book, Stand By. And you can get it anywhere books are sold, Barnes and Noble, Amazon. It just came out on Kindle yesterday. And I'm working on Audible now. I'm going to do my own voicing of the book
Nice.
because I kind of reached out to readers. I threw a net out. Do you want to hear from me, or are you way over me and you'd like to hear from someone else? And people have said, since it's your story, why don't you record it? I'm like, okay. So that'll take a few months to come out. And then I have a website, an author website. So www.bethmcdmedia.
Beth, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you.
Ari, thank you. And great questions. I enjoyed talking journalism with you.
I appreciate you. Thank you. I'm going to take that as high praise.